they conquered the city with charm.
They built an empire from the shadows, liquor running through their veins, lies stitched into every promise. But when love becomes the deadliest addiction, even kings and queens of crime must pay the price. Before we dive into their world of passion, power, and prohibition, make sure you're subscribed. What you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a warning written in whiskey and blood. The rain was steady that night, thin, silvery strands slicing through the glow of a flickering street lamp. Down on Chicago's south side, where the cobblestones still remembered the thunder of carriages and the whispers of sin, a man named Vincent Morelli leaned against a brick wall, a cigarette hanging loose from his lips. He wasn't much yet, just a dock worker with calloused hands and a crooked smile. But even then, there was something dangerous in the way he looked at the world, like he knew it owed him more than it ever gave. Inside the bar across the street, a woman was singing. Her name was Evelyn Evie Malone, and her voice had the kind of velvet ache that made even the drunkest men sober for a few seconds just to listen. She was new to the city, running from something she never talked about. A small-town preacher's daughter with a suitcase full of dreams and a few bruises that hadn't quite faded yet. When Vincent first saw her, the world slowed down. He always said later that it wasn't her beauty that caught him, but the way she looked like she didn't belong anywhere, just like him. The bar was a dim, smoky place, half legal and half not, where whiskey was served under the table and names were never real. Prohibition had turned every good man into a liar and every bad man into a businessman. Vincent had been dabbling in both, running small-time liquor shipments off the docks for a local crew. It wasn't much, but it kept food on the table and the thrill in his blood. Evie saw that in him, the hunger, the recklessness, and maybe that's what drew her close. Their first conversation was over a broken bottle. Vincent had gotten into a scuffle with a drunken customer who called her a name, and by the time the fight was over, the other guy was bleeding. Vincent's knuckles were raw, and Evie was standing over them both with fire in her eyes. She wasn't scared of him. That was new. That was dangerous. They started seeing each other after hours, long walks by the river where the moonlight shimmered on bootleg whiskey crates drifting quietly downstream. She'd hum old tunes. He'd tell her stories about his childhood, how he grew up watching his father work himself to the bone for pennies, how he swore he'd never live small like that. Evie listened, her fingers tracing circles on his arm. "You want more than money, don't you?" She'd whisper. "You want to matter?" Vincent laughed, but she was right. He didn't just want to live, he wanted to be remembered. It wasn't long before the small jobs turned into bigger ones. The city was a machine of greed, and Prohibition had oiled its gears. Vincent's knack for organization and Evie's ability to charm anyone she spoke to made them a perfect pair. He handled the muscle and the deals. She handled the people. Together, they started running shipments not just for others, but for themselves. It began with one truck, then two, then five. They used the bar where she sang as their front, calling it the Silver Swan. Every bottle that passed through those doors was marked with their initials in secret. A small V&E burned into the wood of the crates. Soon they had bartenders, drivers, and even cops on their payroll. Everyone got a cut. Everyone kept quiet. But beneath the shine of success, the danger grew. The more money they made, the more enemies they attracted. Rival bootleggers, jealous club owners, even the police who wanted their piece of the pie. Vincent started carrying a gun everywhere, even to dinner. Evie noticed how the light in his eyes began to harden, how his laughter came less often. One night, after a deal went bad and bullets tore through their delivery truck, she found him sitting alone in the back of the Silver Swan, smoke curling around his face. "How many times can we do this before it catches up?" she asked quietly. Vincent looked up, eyes cold but honest. "As many times as it takes to never be poor again." Evie didn't argue. She just reached for his hand. That was the thing about them. Love wasn't their weakness. It was their weapon. Together, they made people believe they were untouchable. She'd stand beside him at every party, dressed in satin and diamonds, her laughter echoing through the room while he whispered deals that would feed an army. They looked like royalty, even though their throne was built on liquor crates and lies. By the summer of 1925, they had everything: cars, money, fame in the underworld. Newspapers whispered about the bootlegger couple who ran half the city's speakeasies. Some called them glamorous, others called them dangerous. Both were right, but every empire begins with a secret, and theirs was no different. Evie had started keeping her own. She was meeting someone, a man who claimed to be a businessman, but his shoes were too clean and his questions too sharp. He said he wanted to invest in their operations, expand beyond Chicago. Vincent didn't know, or maybe he pretended not to. Either way, a shadow had entered their marriage. Quiet at first, like the faint smell of smoke before a fire. At night, when the parties were over and the city slept, Vincent would lie awake beside her, listening to the faint hum of jazz from the street below. He wondered if this was the price of ambition, trading peace for power, trust for control. Evie slept with her back turned, her hair spilling across the pillow like black ink, her dreams far away from his reach. The Silver Swan became more than a bar. It was their kingdom and their cage. Every night, Evie performed, her voice floating through clouds of cigarette smoke, while Vincent sat in the corner booth, surrounded by men in suits and secrets. To the crowd, they were the perfect couple. But those who looked closer saw the cracks, the glances too sharp, the silences too long, and still they rose. When the new year came, Vincent threw a party that lit up the city, champagne flowing in defiance of the law, laughter spilling into the streets. But as the clock struck midnight, Evie stood on stage, looking at the man she built everything with, and for a split second her smile faltered. Because deep down she knew everything they'd built was standing on borrowed time. The night ended with fireworks and cheers, but Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was about to turn their empire upside down. In a world of smoke and jazz, where love danced with danger, Vincent and Evie were untouchable. For now. The morning after the Silver Swan's grand New Year's Eve bash, the city woke up to hangovers and headlines. But for Vincent and Evelyn Morelli, it wasn't champagne or music they remembered. It was the promise of something bigger. The night had been a celebration, yes, but also a warning. Money was rolling in faster than ever, and so were the whispers. Competitors were circling like sharks, and law enforcement was tightening its grip. Yet Vincent wasn't afraid. He'd spent his life fighting for scraps. Now he was dining at the table, and he wasn't about to give up his seat. The Silver Swan became their base of operations, a fortress disguised as elegance. Downstairs, the bar glittered with gold chandeliers, laughter, and the sound of piano keys dancing under Evie's fingers. Upstairs, behind locked doors, Vincent's men counted money, drew maps, and planned shipments. Every bottle of liquor that entered Chicago's underbelly passed through their network, from Canadian rum runners to crooked distributors on the East Coast. It was a system built on charm, fear, and flawless timing. Vincent wasn't the strongest man, but he was one of the smartest. He understood people, their greed, their weaknesses, their desires. He knew how to make a deal that sounded too good to refuse, then quietly ensured it couldn't be broken. And Evie, she was his secret weapon. Her voice wasn't just entertainment, it was influence. Men trusted her, admired her, sometimes even fell for her, and Vincent let them. Because that's what power looked like in their world, knowing how to use every advantage without blinking. By 1926, they weren't just bootleggers. They were legends. Rumors said their liquor flowed through every speakeasy from Chicago to Detroit. Their drivers were ghosts on the road, never caught, never questioned. The cops on their payroll made sure of that. Vincent even struck deals with rival gangs, offering them a cut in exchange for peace. It worked, for a while. But peace in the underworld is just a lull before the next betrayal. One night, in the back room of the Swan, a new name entered their orbit, Charlie Knuckles DeSoto, a hot-headed enforcer from the East Side. He came to deliver a message from the Giannetti brothers, a rival gang. They wanted in on the Morellis' distribution routes. Evie sat quietly as Vincent listened, her expression unreadable. When Knuckles finished, Vincent leaned forward, lighting a cigarette. "Tell your bosses I don't do charity," he said softly. "If they want in, they'll pay like everyone else." Knuckles smirked. "They don't pay, Vince. They take." The room went still. For a long second, only the sound of Evie's bracelet clinking broke the silence. Then Vincent smiled, a calm, dangerous smile that made the room colder. "Then tell them to bring a bigger cup." Knuckles left, but trouble didn't. Within weeks, their shipments were being hijacked, their drivers beaten or missing. The message was clear. The Gianettis weren't bluffing. Evie begged him to step back, to let it go before it got bloody. "Vin," she said one night, pacing the room, "we've got enough to disappear. We can leave this city. Start fresh." Vincent poured himself a drink, eyes fixed on the amber liquid. "You think walking away makes us safe? We built this life, Evie. If we run, it all catches up. It always does." She stared at him, tears glinting in the low light. "Then what happens when it catches up anyway?" He didn't answer, because deep down, he already knew. A week later, Vincent made his move. He gathered his men, armed them with Tommy guns and determination, and hit one of the Gianetti warehouses. The air was thick with gunfire and smoke. By dawn, half the building was ash, and the Gianetti brothers had lost more than liquor. They'd lost control. Word spread fast. The Morellis weren't just survivors. They were untouchable. After that, everyone wanted a piece of their operation. Politicians, cops, club owners, everyone had their hand out. Vincent fed them all just enough to keep them loyal, and Evie made sure their enemies stayed friendly at the parties she hosted. Their home became the epicenter of the city's underground elite, filled with champagne, laughter, and whispered deals. But while their empire grew, so did the distance between them. Vincent became obsessed with expansion. He wanted to move east, to New York, to build something no bootlegger had ever dared. Evie, meanwhile, longed for something simpler. A life where her voice wasn't a weapon, where she could breathe without fear of betrayal or blood. One evening, she found herself talking again to that businessman she'd met months before, a man named Daniel Graves. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a federal agent working undercover, assigned to take down the city's largest bootlegging syndicates. And now he had his eyes on Vincent. Daniel wasn't like the men Evie knew. He spoke softly, listened carefully, and never treated her like a pawn. That made him dangerous, not just to Vincent's empire, but to her heart. She knew the risk, yet she kept meeting him in quiet corners, passing along small bits of information she told herself didn't matter. But it did. It always did. Meanwhile, Vincent's paranoia grew. He started suspecting leaks in his organization. Deals went wrong. Trucks disappeared. Meetings were ambushed. He trusted no one, not even Evie, though he never said it aloud. One night, after a deal in Cicero turned deadly, he came home bruised and bloodied. Evie rushed to his side, but he pushed her away. "They knew, Evie. They knew where we'd be, what we'd have." Somebody talked. Her heart pounded, guilt clawing at her throat. "Maybe it was just bad luck," she said. "There's no luck in this business," Vincent growled. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before: doubt. Not in the world, in her. The days that followed were a storm of violence and whispers. Vincent tightened his grip, cutting off anyone he couldn't control. Men disappeared, friends turned to ghosts, and still, Evie sang each night at the Silver Swan, her voice softer now, heavier, as if every note carried a secret she couldn't confess. Then came the night that changed everything. A routine shipment on the outskirts of town turned into an ambush. Machine guns rattled through the dark, headlights flared, and when it was over, 6 of Vincent's best men lay dead in the mud. The police arrived within minutes, too fast to be coincidence. Vincent barely escaped. But the moment he stumbled back to the Swan, drenched in rain and rage, he knew. Someone close had betrayed him. He found Evie in their dressing room, wiping off her stage makeup. "Where were you tonight?" he asked, his voice low, trembling with fury. Her hands froze. "Here, singing." He stepped closer, eyes searching hers. "They were waiting for us, Evie. Cops, feds, all of them. Somebody gave them the route." For a moment she thought he'd pulled the trigger right there. But instead he turned away, smashing his fist through the mirror. The shards glittered on the floor like broken promises. Without another word, he walked out, into the storm, into the darkness, into the next war that would define them both. And Evie, she wept, knowing that love and lies were now the same thing. The Silver Swan still stood on the corner of Dearborn and 11th, but by 1927 its glow had changed. The laughter was louder, the money thicker, the whiskey smoother, but the warmth was gone. Beneath the silken champagne, something rotten was festering. Vincent and Evie's empire had grown beyond imagination, but so had the cracks beneath its golden surface. The city whispered their names like a legend. Vincent Morelli, the iron-fisted bootlegger with the mind of a general, and Evelyn Malone, the songbird whose voice could melt hearts and mask betrayals. To the world, they were glamorous and untouchable. But behind closed doors, their empire ran on secrets, and those secrets were starting to bleed through the walls. Vincent was different now. The boy who once dreamed of never being poor again had turned into a man who couldn't sleep unless he controlled everything around him. He'd built a vast network of distilleries hidden in barns, basements, and even funeral homes. His drivers ran liquor up and down the Midwest like veins in a body that never stopped moving. Politicians, police chiefs, judges, he owned them all. Money bought silence. Fear kept it. Evie watched him from across crowded rooms and smoky lounges, wondering when he had become a stranger. She still sang every night at the Silver Swan, though her songs had turned mournful, tinged with guilt. Her secret meetings with Daniel Graves, the federal agent she'd once thought harmless, had become a noose around her neck. What started as curiosity had turned into confession, and confession had turned into treason. Daniel had promised her protection. "You help us bring him down," he'd said in that calm, careful tone of his, "and I'll make sure you disappear before it all burns." But Evie didn't want to disappear. Not really. She wanted Vincent to stop, to walk away before the empire swallowed them whole. She told herself she was saving him. That was the lie that let her sleep. Vincent's paranoia had become gospel. He trusted no one, not even himself. His men noticed. Some began to whisper that he'd lost his touch. Others plotted behind his back, tempted by the fortune and fame that came with betrayal. But none dared cross him openly. Vincent's punishments were legend, swift, quiet, and final. One evening, in a smoke-filled back room of the Swan, a man named Tony Bianchi tried to test that legend. Tony had been with Vincent from the beginning, a driver, loyal and tough, but desperation makes fools of men. He'd started working with the Giannetti brothers again, feeding them shipment routes for cash. Vincent found out. They dragged Tony into the basement while the music played upstairs. Vincent didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He stood there, sleeves rolled up, watching as his men tied Tony to a chair. "You were family," Vincent said softly. "You ate at my table." Tony stammered, begged, cried out names that didn't matter anymore. When it was over, the basement was quiet except for the dripping of water from a leaky pipe. Vincent left without looking back. That night, Evie found blood on his cuffs. She didn't ask whose it was. She just poured him a drink and whispered, "How many more before it's enough?" He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in months, there was something human in his eyes. "It'll never be enough," he said. Their empire reached its height that summer. They controlled most of the liquor traffic from the Great Lakes down to St. Louis. They threw parties that made the newspapers, their faces flashing in photographs beside senators and movie stars. The press called them the king and queen of the roaring underground. But in the shadows, the feds were closing in. Daniel had been patient. He'd gathered enough evidence to cripple the operation, but he needed one thing: Vincent's ledger, the book that tracked every bribe, every shipment, every dollar that flowed through their empire. And only Evie knew where it was. One humid July night, she met Daniel in the alley behind a theater. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If he finds out, he'll kill me." Daniel took her hands, his eyes gentle but relentless. "If you don't help me, he'll take you down with him." "You can't save him anymore, Evie. You can only save yourself." For a moment, she wanted to believe him. But love, especially the kind built on crime and chaos, doesn't fade quietly. It claws, it burns, it lingers. 2 nights later, Vincent found the letter. It was half burned in the fireplace, the edge of Daniel's handwriting still visible. She'd meant to destroy it, but couldn't bring herself to finish. Vincent read what was left, and everything he feared became truth. When Evie came home, he was sitting in the dark, the fire still glowing faintly beside him. The silence was suffocating. "Where were you?" he asked. Her voice trembled. "Out. I needed air." He stood, stepping closer, his shadow stretching across the room. "Who's Daniel Graves?" Her breath caught. For a second, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. "I tried to stop it," she said finally, her voice breaking. "They were going to arrest you, Vin. I thought if I helped." He didn't let her finish. The glass in his hand shattered against the wall, whiskey dripping like tears down the wallpaper. "Help?" he shouted. "You fed them my life, Evie. You think love excuses that? She flinched but didn't back away. "I loved you enough to want you alive." He turned away, gripping the edge of the piano where she used to play. "You should have let me die a long time ago," he whispered. That night, he disappeared. His men said he went underground, literally. Rumor had it he moved his entire operation beneath the city, using old tunnels from the days of the Great Fire. Others claimed he fled to Canada. Evie stayed behind, trapped in a house that no longer felt like home, her name whispered in fear and hatred. Days turned to weeks. The feds raided the Silver Swan, tearing apart walls and floors, but they found nothing. Vincent's ledger was gone. So was Vincent. Daniel tried to convince her to testify, to start over under a new name. But Evie refused. "You can change my name," she said softly, "but you can't change what I did." Then one night, as rain lashed against the windows, she found an envelope on her dressing table. No return address, no name, just a note in Vincent's handwriting. "Every empire falls. Ours just fell harder because we built it with love." Inside was a single photograph. The two of them, laughing at the opening night of the Silver Swan, untouched by blood or lies. Evie pressed it to her chest and cried until the dawn came, knowing that somewhere out there, Vincent was still breathing, but their story had already ended. The papers said the Morelli empire was finished. But the truth? It was just hiding. And in the shadows of the city, people still drank their liquor, whispered their names, and wondered when the king would return to reclaim his throne. By the spring of 1928, Chicago's underworld had gone quiet. Too quiet. The Morelli name, once whispered in admiration or fear, now hung in the air like a ghost, heavy and unspoken. The Silver Swan was boarded up, its chandelier gathering dust, its piano keys silent beneath a thin film of ash. The bootlegger couple who once ruled the roaring Twenties had vanished from the spotlight, leaving behind only rumors and bodies. Some said Vincent fled to Montreal, smuggling his fortune across the border in whiskey crates. Others claimed he was dead, buried somewhere in the tunnels he'd built under the city. But the truth was neither romantic nor clean. Vincent Morelli was still in Chicago, hiding in the bones of the empire he'd built, watching it rot piece by piece. He lived now in the cellar of an abandoned warehouse near the river, surrounded by damp air, rotting wood, and a dwindling pile of cash. The once sharp suits were gone, replaced with workman's clothes. His hair, once slick and dark, was now streaked with gray. He'd traded bourbon for bitterness and slept beside a loaded gun every night. Every sound above made him flinch. Every knock on the door felt like a ghost come to collect. He'd lost everything. His business, his men, and worst of all, the woman he built it all for. Evie. She hadn't disappeared. The feds had taken her into custody months earlier, questioning her, twisting her words, trying to turn her into their trophy witness. But Evie was no fool. She gave them enough to keep them guessing and not enough to bury Vincent for good. When they finally released her, she was a shadow of the woman she'd been. The songs were gone. Her voice, once golden and sweet, had gone hoarse from nights of silence. She lived in a small apartment above a laundry shop now, under a different name. To the world, Evelyn Malone was dead. But to the city's few who still remembered, she was the ghost of the Silver Swan. Sometimes late at night, she'd walk by the river, the same one where Vincent used to unload his shipments under the cover of fog. The moonlight shimmered on the water, and she'd catch her reflection, pale and unfamiliar. She wondered if he was still out there somewhere watching. He was. Vincent followed her from afar, always at a distance. He couldn't bring himself to speak to her. Too much blood stood between them now. Too many lies. But he watched, like a man watching the last flicker of a fire he started and couldn't put out. The city was changing. Prohibition was dying. The new players were moving in, younger, faster, smarter. They had machine guns instead of charm, accountants instead of loyalty. The Morellis had been pioneers, but now they were fossils of a dying age. Then, one rainy afternoon, Vincent got word through an old contact. Daniel Graves was back in town. The same federal agent who'd used Evie, who'd torn their empire apart, was now leading a task force to wipe out the last of the bootlegging rings. Vincent felt something ignite inside him again, not ambition, but fury. He began to plan. He didn't want his empire back. He didn't want money or fame. He wanted justice or maybe revenge. He no longer knew the difference. He reached out to the few loyal men who hadn't turned on him, the old guard who still remembered the name Morelli with pride. They met in back rooms, abandoned barns and church basements, piecing together what little remained of their operation. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about survival. But Evie, she wanted nothing to do with it. When Vincent finally confronted her, stepping from the fog one night as she walked home, she froze like she'd seen a ghost. He looked thinner, older, but the fire in his eyes was still there. "Evie," he said, voice low, trembling. "You're alive." She laughed bitterly. "Barely. You should have stayed gone." "I couldn't," he said. "Not while that bastard's still breathing." She shook her head. "Vin, it's over. The world's moved on. You can't fight shadows." But Vincent wasn't listening. "He used you," he said, stepping closer. "He destroyed everything we built. Don't you want to see him pay?" Her eyes softened for just a second, a flicker of the old Evie. "I wanted peace." "Vin, not another war." Then she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone under the street lamp. Rain running down his face like tears he refused to shed. Vincent didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, he hunted down Daniel Graves like a man possessed. He found out where he stayed, who he met, where he drank. He even had a chance, one cold night outside a jazz club on the north side. Graves stepped out, adjusting his hat, and Vincent's hand went to his gun. But something stopped him. A saxophone played from inside the club. The same tune Evie used to sing. That was enough. He lowered the gun and disappeared back into the rain. He realized then that revenge wouldn't bring anything back. Not the laughter, not the empire, not the woman he loved. The barrels had run dry. The music was over. Weeks later, the police raided the warehouse where Vincent had been hiding. Someone tipped them off. Maybe a desperate ally, maybe fate itself. When they kicked down the door, all they found was an empty chair, a pack of cigarettes, and a single note pinned to the wall. "The liquor's gone, the lies are spent. Tell the city we finally sobered up." No one saw Vincent Morelli again. Some said he drowned himself in the river. Others believed he escaped, vanished into the wind like every ghost before him. As for Evie, she eventually left Chicago. She was last seen singing at a small club in New Orleans under the name Evelyn Lee. Her voice had changed, deeper, rougher, laced with the weight of everything she'd lost. But when she sang about love and ruin, people listened like she was telling their story too. One evening, between sets, a stranger left her a folded envelope on the piano. Inside was a photograph, the same one Vincent had once sent her, the two of them laughing at the silver swan. On the back, in fading ink, it read, "The river runs quiet now. Be free." Evie closed her eyes, the crowd's chatter fading to silence. For the first time in years, she smiled. The age of bootleggers was over. The empires had crumbled. But their story, of love, lies, and liquor, lingered like the last drop of whiskey at the bottom of a glass, bitter, burning, unforgettable. And in the dark corners of Chicago, old men still whispered of the Morellis, the couple who rose from nothing, ruled everything, and lost it all to the only thing stronger than power: love. Time has a way of rewriting legends, polishing the dirt until only the gold shines through. By the early 1930s, the world had changed. The Great Depression had swallowed the glitter of the roaring 20s. The jazz grew quieter, the liquor ran legal again, and the underworld turned its focus elsewhere: gambling, racketeering, politics. Yet in the dim corners of old Chicago bars, one story still poured like fine whiskey. The tale of Vincent and Evelyn Morelli, the bootlegger couple who ruled an era and vanished like smoke when the lights came on. No one could agree on what really happened to them. Some said Vincent drowned in the river, swallowed by the same water that once carried his fortune. Others swore they saw him years later in Havana, drinking rum under an assumed name, his hair white, but his eyes sharp as ever. A few whispered that he'd returned to the city, older, quieter, living among ghosts in some forgotten speakeasy basement, content to let the world forget him. As for Evie, she became something of a myth herself. Her name resurfaced in jazz clubs and dusty records, in smoky lounges where singers tried to mimic her style, but never her sorrow. She was the kind of voice that made men close their eyes and remember women they'd lost, or lives they'd never lived. In New Orleans, the locals said she never talked about her past, but every song she sang was a confession wrapped in melody. The legend said she died on stage one night. Mid-song, the spotlight on her face, a faint smile on her lips, and then she just fell, as if the music had finally taken what was left of her. But when they went to her apartment later, all they found was a suitcase packed neatly by the door and an old photograph, the same one from the Silver Swan, faded and soft at the edges. No address, no letter, just two ghosts smiling through time. It's easy to romanticize people like Vincent and Evie, to forget the blood, the lies, the broken promises that built their empire. But for those who lived through it, their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was a warning. Every dream they chased came with a cost, and every victory carried a shadow. One man who remembered was Frankie Odell, a former bartender at the Silver Swan, who'd been barely 20 when the Morellis ruled the night. Decades later, Frankie ran a small tavern near the river, serving cheap beer to dock workers and telling stories to anyone who'd listen. When asked about Vincent, he'd lean in close, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Vin Morelli wasn't a bad man, he'd say. He just didn't know when to stop. The city gave him everything, and he thought it loved him for it. But this city doesn't love anyone. It just waits for you to bleed. Then, after a long sip, he'd add with a crooked grin, "But Evie? That girl had fire. She could have had any life she wanted, but she chose his. That's what killed them both. Not the feds, not the rivals, not even the booze. Just love." The younger men would laugh, call it sentimental nonsense. But the older ones, the ones who'd lived long enough to lose something worth keeping, they just nodded. They understood. The Morelli legacy didn't die with them, though. Their story became legend, and legends have a way of mutating, surviving, seducing the next generation. In the 1940s, pulp magazines started printing serialized true crime tales about them, embellished, dramatized, dripping with glamour. In one version, Evie was a femme fatale who betrayed Vincent for money. In another, she was a tragic heroine who took the fall for his sins. And in the most popular version, they both escaped together, sailing into the Caribbean, with enough gold to buy their own kingdom. None of it was true. But maybe that was the point. The truth was never what kept people talking. It was the myth, the glittering, dangerous illusion that love could survive the dirt of crime and come out shining. Decades later, long after the Silver Swan was torn down and replaced by a parking lot, the city uncovered a tunnel during construction, an old brick passage that led nowhere. Inside, buried under a pile of debris, they found a rusted metal flask and a small wooden box sealed with wax. Inside the box were a few gold coins, a broken locket, and a note, nearly illegible with age. For the ones who still remember us, raise a glass, but never follow our path. The signature had faded, but everyone who saw it knew the names: Vincent and Evelyn Morelli. The discovery made headlines for a week. Reporters dug up old photos, historians debated, and for a brief moment, the city remembered its lost king and queen of the underworld. Then, as all things do, the noise faded and the world moved on again. But legends, real legends, don't die so easily. In the back of that same construction site, one of the workers found something else. A small metal plate half buried in concrete, engraved with the initials V and E, the same mark that once branded every crate of their forbidden liquor. The worker pocketed it, not knowing its story, and later sold it at a pawn shop for $5. From there, it passed through countless hands: collectors, historians, dreamers, each one adding their own chapter to the myth. Maybe that's the true legacy of the Morellis. Not the money they made or the lives they ruined, but the story they left behind. A story that refused to die, that slipped through time like a fine whiskey burn, smooth and haunting all at once. And somewhere, in a dim corner of an old jazz bar, someone still plays the song Evie used to sing, soft and low, with the kind of ache only love and regret can teach. The bartender pours a glass, sets it beside an empty chair, and says quietly, "For Vincent." Because maybe, just maybe, some ghosts never leave. They just sit at the bar, listening to the music, waiting for their last drink. And if you listen closely enough, when the lights dim and the last note fades, you might still hear her voice in the shadows, whispering through the years, soft as smoke and sharp as memory. Every empire falls, but love lingers. That's how the Morellis are remembered, not as monsters or heroes, but as something far more dangerous: human. Two souls who built an empire from nothing, fed it with their passion, and burned with it when the fire got too high. The city has forgotten their faces, but not their story. And maybe that's all any of us ever get. A story that outlives our sins. So the next time you raise a glass, remember the king and queen of the bootleggers. Remember that every toast has a cost, and every love built on lies will one day run dry, because in the end, even the finest liquor turns to dust. But a good story, that lasts forever.